Alright, y'all, so today I want to make a really quick video to cover a really fascinating sequel to one of the best films in the 90s, one of the best Jim Carrey films of all time, aka The Mask. In this video, I want to talk about the original canceled sequel to The Mask 2. Researching this video and kind of getting into the history of The Mask and franchise and film, I actually discovered that there was quite a bit for a sequel. And as a kid growing up, I loved The Mask, and I was always kind of confused why there was never a follow-up, especially since the first one was so successful and there just seemed to be a lot of really good things. I mean, critically it was also beloved. And it's kind of crazy that New Line didn't immediately jump on a sequel, and it took them over 10 years to eventually make a follow-up, which wasn't really a true sequel. It was kind of just a loose sequel, sort of reboot, if you will. Of course, the more infamous Son of a Mask. But that being said, to my surprise in researching this video, there was quite a bit for a proposed sequel to The Mask. And ultimately, as we all know, it sadly got canceled. It was never to be. We got the film that we got. And yeah, I just kind of wanted to make a video to cover it, give you all the information I was able to find, and ultimately give you my thoughts. So, like all my other canceled videos, I'm going to give you a background, the content itself, a little bit of the history of it, ultimately why it was canceled and scrapped, and the aftermath and my overall opinions on this lost and canceled film, The Mask 2. So regardless, like The Mask itself in the movie said, let's rock this joint. Alright, so first for the background. So after the release of The Mask from 1994, it was a smash hit. It was a huge box office hit. You got to remember that this was like the breakout year for Jim Carrey as an actor. He had released in February Ace Ventura. That was a huge smash hit for him as well. And then the follow-up, which was The Mask, came out, and it was huge. He became such a superstar overnight, and his asking price, which I'll get into later, which was kind of one of the reasons why it seemed the sequel didn't happen, grew astronomically. When he actually did Dumb and Dumber in that same year in 1994, his salary for that movie jumped massively because of the success of Ace Ventura and eventually The Mask. Now, The Mask was a huge hit. I believe it made over $300 million, and naturally after that, I mean, more than broke even. Naturally, New Line Cinema looked at doing a sequel. I mean, who wouldn't, especially after a hugely successful film like that? So there was immediate plans and early discussions about doing a follow-up with Jim Carrey and The Mask. And some ideas were starting to bubble with the creative team, and Chuck Russell, who was the director of the first one, intended on writing the film and also planned on directing the canceled sequel, The Mask. The Mask 2, so to speak. And early ideas were kind of discussed, and over the years we've gotten a few bits of information and ideas. There was allegedly a treatment and a full-on script that was made for this sequel. Now, sadly, as far as I know, the treatment or the script have never made it online, so we're just kind of taking it from the word of mouth, so to speak, from Russell, also the CEO of Dark Horse Comics, Richardson, and just kind of, taking it upon their word what was actually being developed for the sequel. So it's a lot of really interesting stuff and fascinating stuff. So what was the actual story and the proposed ideas for this planned sequel? So let's get into it. So one thing is that when Richardson was speaking to people about the proposed sequel years later, they had apparently first made a treatment, of course, and the idea was that it was going to be an immediate sequel to the first Mask movie. Tina, the character that would have been played by Cameron Diaz, would have returned and basically been kind of the major character of this one. And the whole concept and idea was that Tina would have somehow gotten the mask and basically became the Mask after Carrey did as well. At some point in the story, Tina was going to go to Las Vegas. His boyfriend Stanley would have followed. Obviously, mayhem would have ensued with Tina becoming her own version of the Mask. Chaos, especially with the big shows and the mobsters and stuff. And there would have been some kind of conflict with gangsters. And Richardson also wanted to include a character that came from the Mask comics, Walter, into the franchise. Really interesting stuff. So that's really cool. Tina would have been the main focus of the movie. Jim Carrey as Stanley would have been the movie. It's kind of unclear what role. It could have been he would have been just a supporting role here, or possibly, could have had a bigger role. Who knows, even in, if in this version of the movie, he would have had the opportunity to become his version of the Mask again, or Mask, excuse me. We just don't know. But yeah, there was also other ideas, and Russell would kind of elaborate on certain concepts and scripts and stuff. Like I mentioned, he would eventually, it seemingly upgrade this script, or excuse me, the treatment to become a script. And he kind of echoed a lot of the ideas Richardson said. He wanted Cameron Diaz to be the main focus of the movie. He wanted Tina to become the Mask and basically be a major focus of the sequel. Now, even though they built the script, they apparently, like I said before, they went to Las Vegas and chaos would ensue. Apparently, the script, according to Russell himself, said he built the script around Christmas, and they talked about multiple locations about where the characters could go. Obviously, they talked about going to Las Vegas, but they also talked about Paris. So there could have been different locations for what this film was going to contain. It could have been a Las Vegas movie. It could have been characters going to Paris. We really don't know. There also would have been a character and possibly maybe kind of a love triangle or some kind of romantic tension in the relationship between Stanley and Tina, as apparently Russell had spoken with the actor Antonio Banderas about playing a photographer character that would have tried to steal Cameron Diaz's character Tia away from Stanley. So there could have been some kind of conflict there and some kind of romantic tension, some kind of plot to revolving around mobsters and, of course, Walter, which honestly, that sounds like an amazing idea. Walter is such a fascinating conflict and character in the original Mask comics, and just seeing that would have been crazy. I'm sure they would have toned him down, especially how he just loves pain and stabbing things in himself, like in the comics. I'm sure they would have toned that down, but that sounds like a really cool and interesting idea. There was also some further details about the film, which I'll get into when this film was officially announced in 1995. Basically, an interview was interviewing Russell about it and basically said that, yep, he's doing a first treatment, he's going to upgrade to a script, and that he wanted to have more musical numbers in this film. Also, the clear intention was they definitely wanted Carrey to be involved, and just kind of wanted to add more musical numbers to this. Now, I'm not really clear if this is going to be a musical, but it would have been, like the first film, it would have had musical numbers. So that's pretty cool and interesting. And there's also another scene from this film. There was this script and treatment that Russell had made that would kind of be the nucleus for what became Son of the Mask. And it basically would have revolved around a baby at some point getting the mask, and of course, all the wild hijinks that would ensue. Now, it's kind of unclear, it sounds like to me that the baby was just there and probably wasn't an important character. Like, it sounds like this was probably just a random scene in the script, or maybe this even could be Tina's baby. Like, maybe she had a daughter with Stanley or a boy or something. It's kind of unclear since Russell's really vague when he's talking about it, but apparently there was a scene in the script/treatment that involved a baby getting the mask. So really interesting stuff. So yeah, as you can tell, there was a lot of work put into this, early talks, early ideas for a story. Like I said, there was some substantial work done for this, and there is a script/treatment somewhere floating around the ethos, so to speak. And, all of it sounds really interesting. Now I'm going to kind of get into more details and ultimately why it was canceled. Now, I already mentioned this earlier, but eventually in 1995, while there was discussions and ideas for a Mask 2 being talked about, the film was officially announced in 1995. And basically where it was announced was at a Nintendo Power Contest for, I believe, the Mask video game, or at least just a normal Nintendo Power Contest. And there was a whole big reveal for it. At the bottom right of the picture I put up for this video, There's kind of an ad for it, and it showcased a bunch of, promises and ideas for a sequel that were proposed, like Jim Carrey coming back, and more musical numbers, and more zany hijinks. And it was officially announced with some artwork made for it, very early stuff. And the winner of the Nintendo Power Contest would basically be able to get a sort of cameo walk-in role for the Mass sequel. So whenever they did start production and film the sequel, that the whoever won the Nintendo Power Contest would win it. And eventually a kid by the name of Nathan Runk, if I'm saying that correctly, became the winner of this contest. And he was kind of awarded that opportunity to win a walk-in role for the Mask film. Now, despite these early ideas, a possible script/treatment, and a clear idea, especially since Russell himself seemed to be enthusiastic about doing it, and also Cameron Diaz was apparently on board with the concept of her playing Tina again and becoming the Mask. This is where some of the roadblocks started to hit the film, so to speak. One of those was Jim Carrey. Now, all the people involved with making the sequel wanted Carrey to come back in some capacity, either as a supporting role or even as a possible main character again. But, despite some enthusiasm, and I think it was reported in 1995, I think the studio may have offered him about $10 million to do a Mask sequel. Ultimately, Carrey decided to kind of step away and kind of decline the offer of doing a sequel. The reason why is because he had his Ace Ventura sequel released a year later in 1995 called Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. And look, I will say this. That movie is a little bit of a guilty pleasure. Not as good as the first one, but, it's not the worst movie I've ever seen. Not even the worst sequel I've ever seen. But regardless, it came out. And while it made a lot of money, it was pretty critically bashed when it came out. It did not hold a candle to the critic response that was the first movie. And as a result, Jim Carrey felt like he was he kind of was really not motivated. He was pushed away from the idea of doing sequels. He just didn't really want to do it, especially after he felt an embarrassment that was doing the second one and how it was received. And he felt like, too, doing a sequel doesn't really challenge you as an actor because you've already played that role before, I guess. Obviously, this would be a stance that he would revert years later, but at the time in 1995, when movement on a sequel seemed like it was the strongest, Carrey decided that he really didn't want to be involved. Now, he was still semi-interested in doing the project, and it's also kind of speculated that maybe movement on a Jim Carrey style sequel maybe picked up a little bit around the time that Jim Carrey was doing the live action Grinch film, because he was wearing green makeup and there was also a dog. And Russell said that he kind of, like I mentioned earlier, he built a part of the script, or at least, maybe part of it, or maybe the whole script around Christmas. So maybe it was kind of a thing where like Carrey was going to do the Grinch, which was also a Christmas movie. And there could have been talks about doing a Christmas movie sequel with The Mask around that similar time. And Carrey just went to do the sequel or not the sequel, but the Grinch instead. And then just talks kind of broke down. And apparently at some point during the filming of the Grinch, he also received some kind of infection from the makeup that he was wearing as the Grinch that kind of, I'm sure, speculated here, but pushed him away from wearing makeup and doing all that stuff again, which he would require to do for a sequel. And ultimately, Carrey's lack of interest, not wanting to do a sequel, and, all the team involved wanting him to be involved, even the studio, of course, offering him $10 million to do the project, and early ideas and concepts, it was eventually quietly scrapped. The kid who won the Nintendo Power Contest back in 1995, despite the, promises he was going to have a walk-in role for the sequel, it became clear the sequel wasn't going to happen. So what's really cool is that basically the winner of the contest was still given something. He was apparently given $5,000, some games, and a production jacket as kind of an apology. And apparently also got to chat with the actress who voices Princess Peach in the old Mario games, which honestly, that's pretty cool stuff. I mean, at least he got something out of it, and I think he made a few videos online talking about the whole thing. So, yeah, pretty crazy stuff. And that was that. That was basically the story of the original Mask 2 that got canceled. Russell would be kind of interested in doing it, but ultimately never happened due to all the factors I mentioned. Now, despite the fact that the film got canceled, ultimately movement on a sort of follow-up to The Mask still continued, and eventually it picked up again in 2001 when the creative team behind Cats and Dogs, which I believe, who I think the director of Cats and Dogs directed The Son of the Mask. But the idea of doing a sort of loose follow-up was kind of presented. They apparently had read Chuck Russell's script and I guess saw the scene with the baby getting the mask, and that kind of spurred on the creation and the idea that would eventually become The Son of the Mask. And I'm not going to get too deep into that movie and the production of that movie, but, kind of seeds of The Son of the Mask were kind of spread in Chuck Russell's script, allegedly, and then eventually it was kind of taken by New Line Cinema, revamped, and we eventually got The Son of the Mask, which eventually released in 2005 to very infamous reviews and critically and majorly financially bombed. And that's kind of the sad truth of the sequel that we eventually got and the canceled sequel that came from it. In terms of discussing potential reboots and follow-up to The Mask, as the story doesn't quite in here, over the years, Carrey's been asked multiple times about doing a Mask 2, and, over the years, his stance on sequels has been reverted. Famously, he did the Dumb and Dumber 2 film, and, he's been asked a few times in interviews, and he said that he would be on board with doing a sequel if the concept and the idea is there. Russell has also expressed interest in doing a sequel if Jim's on board and stuff. Even Cameron Diaz has expressed interest in returning and is on board if Jim's on board and Russell is on board, allegedly. So, like I said, there's a potential, encouragement, and definitely the actors involved would be open to the possibility if the concept is there and right, which, if they do a sequel with those actors, they would have to revamp the concept completely from what they were trying to do originally with this version of the canceled sequel. But other than that, it seems pretty clear that we're probably never going to get a true Mask sequel involving Jim Carrey, at least at the time I'm making this video. Now, there has been some slight discussions about doing a Mask reboot. Richardson, the CEO of Dark Horse, has expressed interest in doing a female-led, dark and gritty reboot for The Mask that's something more similar to the comics, but also have a well-respected or really solid female comedian involved, and really have no idea what that would have been like, but, that's basically an idea. I don't think it was officially announced. I think he was just interested in doing that as an idea and concept, and he's apparently shopped around the idea of doing a reboot with other people, and there's been multiple false starts to the project, so it's kind of unclear if we're ever going to get a Mask reboot or sequel or anything like that. I also wanted to quickly mention, I forgot to mention this when I was discussing the sequel. Chuck Russell, the director of the first one, apparently in a 1996 Laserdisc commentary, also expressed interest that he wanted to have Peggy's character, who was played by Amy Yazbek, to come back in the sequel. Apparently, one of the reasons why is because they cut out the death scene for her in the final film, so it kind of left it open for her to be involved with the follow-up. So he also wanted to have her involved, Jim Carrey involved, Cameron Diaz possibly as a title role, and Antonio Banderas as a character who is a photographer that tries to steal, or at least successfully got into a relationship with Tina. Would have been set in Vegas or Christmas in terms of time setting, and also Paris as well. And would have possibly had Walter being introduced in the film. And it would have had some crazy plot revolving around gangsters and mobsters, most likely. But yeah, that's kind of what happened to the aftermath of The Mask, the sad truth, the sequel that we got, and the possible reboot, and really just the unclear future of The Mask in terms of adaptations and film and stuff that we're currently in the future. Now for my overall opinions on this canceled Mask sequel, The Mask 2. I gotta be honest with you, mate, especially considering the fact that I have seen Son of the Mask. It is quite disappointing we never got to see this sequel. I was really surprised how much information and ideas there was for a sequel, just because my assumption was there just wasn't really any real effort to make a sequel, but turns out there was. It's just there was multiple roadblocks that got in the way to prevent it from happening. But yeah, some of the ideas that were kind of proposed for this film sound pretty cool. I think Tina taking a central role and possibly becoming the Mask is really cool. It's similar to the comics. After Stanley gets shot by his girlfriend, yes, that happens in the comics, she temporarily becomes the Mask. So it makes sense for another character to get it here. I think it would make things fresh. I mean, especially since the comic run has tons of characters taking on the Mask from all walks of life, so to speak. So I think it's a pretty cool idea, and I think it also would have just kind of focused on Diaz's character more. I also would have loved to seen Stan Lee, aka Jim Carrey, come back, even had an opportunity to play the Mask again. It's pretty clear that, he probably would have taken a back seat in the sequel, just my kind of assumption there. Like I said, he could have been a supporting character, but it still would have been awesome for him to be in a sequel, even, in any kind of capacity. It would have been really cool. I also think the idea of going to a new setting like Vegas or Paris, that's pretty cool. That's rife with opportunity. And I am so heartbroken that we never got to see Walter brought into live action. I mean, he's one of the most fascinating characters in the comics, and he's pretty much the biggest threat to the Mask, and arguably the most mysterious character. And the fact is, they were thinking about putting him into a sequel. That's awesome. I would have loved to see that. I really can't tell you who would have played him at the time, but it would have been really cool. And I'm really disappointed we just never got to see that. And all the potential actors involved sound pretty great. And it's just kind of a shame that it all never happened. We got the Son of the Mask instead, which I will say is not the worst movie I've ever seen. Like, there are some parts of it I don't mind, but it was a clear failure on all fronts, from script writing and visual effects, and just a clear downgrade from the first one. So pretty disappointing stuff, but I am hoping for the future that we do get a Mask reboot. I've already mentioned this a few times in previous videos, but I would love to see a Mask reboot that kind of harkens back to more of the comics and maybe make it like a horror movie. I think it's smart to not replicate what Jim Carrey did, but get another actor that has a different take on it and just do a different take with the Mask as a whole. And I think you could potentially have a really good reboot, something that's fresh, it's different from the original, and unique all its own. So that's pretty cool stuff. Also, I will say this, we technically did get a somewhat sequel to Jim Carrey's The Mask in a way. I almost forgot to mention, was the Mask animated series. As far as I remember, it was a series that took place after the movie, and Stan Lee kind of, for whatever reason, I can't remember at the top of my head, reverted his decision to throw away the Mask and decided to get it back again. And basically, that was a whole series of adventures that technically took place after the movie. And it actually ran for, I believe, about 3 seasons. Even though it was much more toned down and kid-friendly even compared to the movie. From what I've heard, it's pretty solid as an overall series. And I think Walter was also introduced in it. So that was really cool. It's a really interesting idea. So yeah, at least, in a way, it didn't exactly die. I mean, we did get a somewhat sequel and a real disappointing sequel. But yeah, I think it's a real big shame we never got to see this movie. I would have loved to seen the same creative team, Chuck Russell and so many of the other actors, come back and do another Mask follow-up. I think the potential, especially if you look at the comic book series, was rife. I think there could have been huge greatness with the sequel that could have been achieved, but it's a shame we just never got it. So yeah, that was kind of the story of the original canceled The Mask 2. All right, y'all. Hopefully you have a good day. Peace, y'all.